they'll see my nostrils when I give the sermon, and that's okay. I have lovely nostrils, so don't just... So my sermon this morning is titled, The Cathedral of the World. And if you've ever been to a cathedral before, the first thing that will strike you is the beauty of the space. I was 8 years old. The first cathedral I saw was in Trondheim, Norway. And if you've seen anything like that, you're just in awe. You're overwhelmed by the stained glass windows, by the statues, by just the gigantic space. But even if you haven't been to a cathedral like that, you've been in beautiful churches, like today, right now. You are in a beautiful church right now. And this is a sacred space because of this. And you can tell that it is. That this has a different feel than if you go to the shopping mall or the grocery store. You can tell by the wood of the pews and the layout here. You can tell by the stained glass windows and the candles and the altar and the cross. You know you entered into a different space. You've entered into a holy space. In that sense, even if somebody had never been to church, if they walked into this sanctuary, there would be this moment of just wanting to be silent because you're in a space like that. I was intrigued by folks who would visit the churches in New Mexico. They were like tourist sites, but people had this intuitive sense when you walked into a sanctuary, tourist site or not, this was a holy place, and you had to respond accordingly. This is what scholars call the sacred. And it has a teaching purpose. It's to teach you about the beauty of God through seeing a beautiful space. To see the transcendence of God, something that takes you out because you've entered into this space. But churches teach you other things too. You can look at the stained glass windows and they will tell a story. Every one of these names, I don't know the history of the congregation, but every one of the names on these windows has a story. And in my previous church in Wyoming, I was kind of a church historian, so I was the one looking up to see what all the names meant and their backgrounds. The altar tells a story of our faith. Do this in remembrance of me. One of my favorite things to do for Sunday school was to take the kids into the sanctuary and see if we could start identify, like, what do the candles mean? What do the symbols on the candles mean? What's that plate there for? The altar. What is that? The baptismal. What do you do with a baptismal? Just so that kids, when they came into the sanctuary, had a feel of like, this is what it all means. This is there's a purpose in how everything is organized here, and it all teaches you something about faith as a result. And cathedrals and churches of all kinds are designed to do that. And you can imagine in medieval Europe, not very literate society, that was really important. The way you learned Christian faith was through the stained glass windows, through the statues, through what you saw. But even in our literate society, it seems apparent that we still need that. We need not just words to read. We need, things for the eyes, for the nose, the sounds. We need to engage all those senses. If anything, modern technology seems to have impressed us on this. It's not enough to have some words. You've got to communicate and embody this particular vision of the beauty of God. So this need exists. This need continues to exist. Places to experience beauty and places to experience God through that beauty. And that is one of the ministries that this church provides without knowing anything else about your congregation and all the mission programs and all that, is literally this space is a gift to the people of Chickasha. Because it provides a context or a space out of all the things that are happening in all the locations in the town where they can experience something beautiful. And that is desperately needed in our world today. Now, when I use the word cathedral, the phrase cathedral of the world, I'm actually referring to the natural world, because there are spaces in the natural world that can perform that same role, the same kind of thing that church buildings do. Natural spaces could be a place of beauty that excites all the senses, and so that provides a space to genuinely encounter God. When I was in Wyoming, there was a church camp called Ring Lake Camp in northwestern Wyoming. And to get there, you've got to drive for hours in what looks like Mars. Have you all seen pictures of Mars with the red landscape, desert? That's what it was for hours. And you turn the corner, and right when you turn the corner, all of a sudden there's this beautiful expanse of like green mountains, lush trees, huge lake. Oddly enough, named Ring Lake. So that was a good naming choice. But that was, you were in awe the moment you turned the corner. And what's intriguing about it when you're there is that if you're kind of walking through the hills, you'll notice all these Native American like writings, and you can see it in the caves. Writings that go back at least 10,000 years. And there was a lot of writings discovered there. And from what folks can discover, or scholars can discover, it was that area was considered a sacred space. And I totally got that on the one level. After going through the desert, this was like an oasis, to see the lake, to see the mountains, just to see the green lush. And I was taken aback. And clearly these Native Americans from 10,000 years ago were taken aback. So that's kind of neat. Like, I had the same reaction, in a way, to these folks, also long ago. That's kind of a sacred connection. You have one over time, that a natural area can produce that same response over time. But it's also because of the beauty of the space itself that elicits that kind of response. That, too, is a sacred. You get that with churches over time, how people over generations are able to kind of appreciate so much of the same space. And natural sites have much of the same. A lot of religions have language to talk about this. I've been teaching world religions at OCCC, and we've just been talking about Shintoism. And in Shintoism, there's the idea of kami, or spirit. And there are certain natural places that have a lot of it. They just have a lot of spirit. So if you've ever seen pictures of what's called a torii, the kind of gate, you'll like see a picture of that in like a river or a lake or on a mountain. It just kind of looks like that. Just wood poles. I'll show you a picture of when we eat afterwards. Beautiful. They're all located all over Japan. But they're located primarily in natural spots. Hard to get places. And but that was a way for them to designate this place has a lot of spirit. Right? This place is a sacred space. And it was always mountains and lakes and rivers and anything, water fountains, anything that kind of captured that feel. Now there is a tradition in the West that has a language like that in the Christian tradition. And in particular, the Reformed tradition, of which the Presbyterian Church USA is a part of. And that starts with the idea that to encounter God in nature starts with the insight we find in Scripture that we read this morning. And one that you find throughout the Psalms over and over again. And so I'll re-quote, "The heavens are telling the glory of God, and the firmament proclaims his handiwork. Day to day pours forth speech, and night to night declares knowledge." So nature is like a church with stained glass windows. At the cathedral that recounts to us the story of our faith, it's like a book written for us to know and understand something central about God. Actually, as Martin Luther used that, nature is a book that God writes in to tell us what God is about. It's like a scripture. It points to us to God's character and God's purposes in the world. And, some kind of, you can imagine, well, when I see nature, I see resilience, so God must be a God of resilience. I see life. When I walked out the door this morning and the birds were just going crazy, God must love sound and music, and then diversity, the diversity of species that you see all around. I have seen more colorful insects in Oklahoma than I ever saw in Montana. Lots of, this is the kind of diversity and beauty that kind of becomes apparent. And that tells us something about what God is and what God is about. But nature doesn't literally use words like the Bible does or like books. And so we have this phrase, there's no speech, nor are there words. Their voice is not heard. And yet, when we encounter God in nature, we in fact get a genuine knowledge of God. And so we have this passage, and yet their voice goes out throughout all the earth, and their words to the end of the world. So John Calvin believed this, and so much so that his the book that everybody reads, the Institutes on the Christian Religion, about a third of it is all dedicated to nature and God in nature. And then if you read the Puritan writings, the ancestors of the Congregationalists, the first thing the Puritans did when they came to North America is they recorded every stream, every kind of tree, every plant life they saw, every animal, every mountainside, or any kind of geological anything. And they would record it in detailed notes. They were our first naturists because they believed that somehow God was communicating to them through nature. So a religious obligation was to know and be aware of kind of their natural landscape. And so if you look through some of those old notes that go back to the 1600s, you're kind of open up to this world that existed in American history. But you also get this kind of sense of what it means to believe that God could be discerned in nature. Now, that discernment can take several forms. There's a discernment of nature where it goes, this part of nature reminds me about God. So maybe the constancy of nature could remind you of God's constancy in character, or the love, that a mother animal gives to its child could remind you of the same kind of love and nurture that God has for us. But there's another kind of discernment of nature that says not that nature reminds me about God, but rather that when I'm engaged in it, I am in fact having a genuine encounter with God. Not a reminding of it, but a genuine encounter with God. That if you want to go and see God, go out there. Or come here. That's my other point. Or come here, and you'll have a genuine... You won't be reminded of God when you come into this sanctuary. You'll actually encounter God when you come into this sanctuary. Or wherever that space is, where you encounter beauty, and you're reminded of these things. And both are valid. Both are ways of talking about God. But to do that, to say that God can be encountered in this way, is to say, well, that God is real, and that if you want to know what that looks like, come here. Or my other place that we've kind of enjoyed since we've been in Oklahoma is the Wichitas. And drive up to Mount Scott, and see the expanse. Whenever I share pictures of that area, they're like, that's not in Oklahoma. Yes, it is in Oklahoma. There really are hills and mountains in Oklahoma. They're different. They're Oklahoman mountains, but they are still real. And the second thing is, if we did this, we'd have to kind of see nature, just like we see church buildings. Church buildings are sacred. We know that. They're used. You use the building, you measure things by their use, but in the end, you also measure it by that this is a holy space. You can't just do anything with this building, right? You wouldn't just let the sanctuary be used for every purpose, because you want this area treated with respect. And presumably, if we thought of nature in that way, nature would have that same. Yes, we use nature, but at some level, we would want to respect it. You'd have to recognize it as holy. There'd be limits on what you could do with it. This reminds me, but in both cases, because they're both places to know God and to enjoy God. And I was reminded of the first line of the Westminster Confession, which I didn't learn when I was in confirmation in church growing up. But the first line is, what is the first duty? And the first duty is to glorify God and to enjoy God. And I thought, well, that's an interesting phrase, to enjoy God. But if we really did start thinking of nature as a place where we could enjoy God, as a place where we couldn't just do anything with it, we'd have to somehow honor it or respect it as a sacred space, just like we would a congregation, a building. That would just call for a huge revolution of values. If we started taking places as sacred places. And we'll not spend the time today to fathom what that would look like. But you do kind of get a model in St. Francis, the Feast of St. Francis, which is a celebration that happened this week. I'll tell you a little story about this. When I was had a friend who's Episcopal campus minister, and they had a picture of a horse walking into the sanctuary of their church for a blessing of the animals, right? But the headline was, St. John's Episcopal Church celebrates the Feast of St. Francis. That church got lots of angry letters going, we think it's highly cruel that you would eat these beautiful animals coming into your building. Because they had interpreted feast as a meal. They were going to eat these animals. No, we're blessing the animals. We're not eating them. So they had a lay fear. It's the Feast of St. Francis. That was a blessing of the animals. And St. Francis has become a model, not only for Roman Catholics, but for Protestants, for all Christians, of what it looks like to be somebody who really cares about the environment. He is actually considered the patron saint for the creation, for animals. And you've seen the statues of St. Francis in gardens as he's preaching to the birds. He would deliver sermons to the birds and the animals. We have that kind of vision. He also had that for the poor. It wasn't simply for animal life, though it was that too. But it's like he kind of saw God everywhere. So he saw it in the poor, he saw it in children, he saw it in animals. This becomes kind of a model for a way of life. And I think the way that St. Francis pulled this off is through a kind of a holy attentiveness to the poor, to the natural world, to children, to animals, to people of every walk, of every age of life. And that kind of attentiveness, this attention that we give, is a way that we express love. So when you notice, everybody seen the color purple? There's that line where the author or one of the characters says, I think it pisses God off if you go by fields of purple and you don't notice it. Right? You don't pay attention. So the ability to pay attention, to be aware, is that expression of love. And when you've done it with somebody who's like the homeless, the walls just kind of come down and they feel like they've been recognized or connected to. When children are paid attention to, not just as, genuinely heard, it's all of a sudden this connection happens. And if you have that moment in nature where you notice, whether it's a color of purple or a particular kind of orange sunset or whatever it is, and you notice it, or the birds in the morning, or in our yard, possums, I don't know. It's somehow you see something sacred and you're attentive to it. There's that moment where the walls kind of break down and this connection happens as a result. And this is what Sally McFay calls sensitive, appreciative awareness of each other, of our world, of one another. Or to quote the Presbyterian minister, Mr. Rogers, appreciation, and this is attentiveness, but appreciation is a holy thing. So I'll just kind of leave you with one idea. When we used to do church camp, we'd ask the children every day in the morning, we'd ask them to notice, where do you see God today? Notice when you play. Notice when you're by the creek. Notice when we're in worship and we have Vespers. Notice when we're eating and we're being sustained by food. Notice when you're playing games. Notice when you're reading the Bible. Notice when you're in the required nap time, because naps can be holy. When is that moment that you encountered God? And note it. And because at the end of the day, we'd all quiz them. That was their quiz. Or did you notice God today? And all the kids would kind of share that. And so that's my homework for you. Since I can't remember everybody's name, I'm going to give you homework. The homework for me was I was supposed to remember everybody's name, which I will not succeed at. But for my homework for you is what I would give to the kids at church camp. Where did you notice God today? Where do you notice God tomorrow? I've had friends who actually keep a journal, and they kind of like, I noticed God today here. Or they might share it on Facebook or something like that. All of a sudden it changes your anticipation. You're walking into the day going with that expectation that at some point you're going to encounter God. And that's a whole different way of looking at the world as a result. Amen. Now, I want to know the order of service here.